I am the warning story for many. Like if
Yeah.
pastors were to make a sermon about me now, it's like the way I think that they would paint me, the way I would have painted me, would be like, see, like she's fallen into sin now. This is what happens when you leave the umbrella of God's protection. You're going to end up on Playboy. Like you're gonna be a harlot with no morals. You're gonna let people use you and abuse you. I was far more abused in church than I ever have been outside of it. I was far more abused in non-churchy but spiritual circles than I ever have been in atheistic circles. That's not to
Right.
say atheists or Christians. Everyone can be can have good and bad in them, and good and bad things can happen in any setting. But I think that what I'd like to say though is just because I happened to find a lot of healing from the damage of purity culture through embracing my sensuality and freely sharing it at within my comfort zone, I also want to stress that that's not the recipe for everyone. And I think sometimes because I'm so free with living in my truth, it unfortunately gives people, from what I've heard, the message that I think that this is the only way to heal from the shame of purity
Right.
culture is to get yourself in a bikini and do a photo shoot. No, 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 no. Please don't ever force yourself to do something that you don't want to do. That's the whole point, is you don't have to do things you don't want to do anymore, and you get
Right.
to do the things that you want. So just because my journey of healing from sexual shame and dogma came out the way it did for me, that does not mean that I champion that as the only way for everyone to heal. I think it's just as powerful to cover up as it is to take it off. Like I really do, because we're all different, and that's another thing, that even though the message of Christianity says that God made each of us unique in our mother's womb and all of that, there is such pressure to be the same. And coming out of that into the real world, celebrating diversity of all kinds. Intellectual diversity is my favorite type of diversity, just because I love hearing different perspectives and ideas about things. But yeah, I just want to stress for anyone who's struggling to free themselves from the shame of purity culture and just for whatever reason just cannot get comfortable in their bodies. I don't think that you have to force yourself to be overcompensating in the other
Yeah.
direction. I've met people who are lifelong atheists and still what some might describe as like prudish. It's like, no, modesty can be a personal choice. It doesn't mean you're still stuck in religion. It doesn't mean you're still stuck in a purity culture mindset. Maybe you're just not a super sensual or publicly sensual person, and that is fine. That is good for you,
Yeah.
you know? And I think it's always good to check ourselves and be like, wait, am I acting out of fear and programming, or is this really how I feel? Like I do
Yeah.
that all the time, you know? I don't
And
know
you
if it ever
should do that
stops.
all the time. Like, and I think that's you said the word agency. I think that to me, and that's why I say like it's so funny because it's so villainized to live outside of the religious world and whatever that looks like, like our
Mm-hmm.
paths look so different. Like my wife's expression of a lot of this stuff versus mine looks different. Like there's so many different views of that. And there's so much diversity, like you said, in personality types and things. And, but I think like, again, I go back to it's all about agency, consent. It's about being able to actually choose it because you want to do it and not because you feel this pressure to do it. And that's where when you get into corruption in whether it's Hollywood or the church, it all comes down to, again, what we talked about at the beginning of the episode, losing yourself and allowing other voices to control you. And I know we're right here at the end, but I want to ask you this question because it's burning in my brain right now.
Okay.
But
Yeah, and I'm in no rush, so feel free.
okay, great. I have 30 questions and they're all
Okay.
burning. But I'll ask you this so you have room for it at least. But
Mm-hmm.
um, one of the things I see happen a lot, and I think this happens with everybody to some extent, I think part of this is natural. But when you leave a high control religious group, I've seen a lot of kids who graduate high school and they start doing a lot of things they weren't allowed to do to spite the world that they grew up in or to spite the teaching that they were given. And again, I think some of that's natural and necessary, and even in some cases, but I am saddened when I see people who are still being controlled by their past experience, and everything they're doing is in reaction instead of figuring out what they want and taking action. Like, they'll drink because they weren't supposed to drink, but they don't like alcohol. Or they'll go date this person they don't like because they know they couldn't date that type of person in that world. Like, how do you check yourself to go, hey, I'm not living in reaction to what I was taught, because that's still giving them control, but I'm living true to who I am, especially when that line is so blurred for so long?
Yes, Eric, you got some good questions. That's a big one. Um,
An
you
easy softball to end out the episode,
yeah, yeah. Let's see here. I think, and it sounds like this is what you were alluding to just moments before you wrapped up that question. But I do think that there's a natural, understandable, and I would argue even healthy pendulum shift where I think when you do grow up extremely, especially if you grow up extremely sheltered or within a very strict, narrow interpretation of a belief, I think that when you leave and all of a sudden the world is your oyster, it can be very helpful to deliberately do the things that you weren't supposed to do to cross the line in order to know where your line is. And that line's going to be different for everyone. And I think sometimes, like, I'm a big fan of learning the hard way. And I'm a big fan of supporting other people learning the hard way because I
Sure.
think it's the most effective way. I also like to observe and do my best to learn through observing others and like learning from their hard mistakes. But at the end of the day, if it's something that I need to find out for myself, I just consciously gave myself permission to do it. I gave myself permission. I may not actually like this, but I'm going to do this to find out because I can't sit here in the theoretical space anymore and wonder. I sometimes I have crossed the line and found out like, oh, I don't think that's actually for me. Like, so for example, polyamory. Like a lot of people, when they deconstruct Christianity, they end up deconstructing the concept of monogamy. And for many people, it leads them to like, I'm actually poly or ethically non-monogamous in some way. For me, it was like, I really let myself explore and go there. And then I was like, oh, I don't think this is for me right now, at least. But that doesn't mean I'm still stuck in a fear-based Christian mindset just because this isn't for me. It just, there's plenty of secular people that's not for either, And I think that for myself in my own internal compass, I weigh whether or not things are healthy for me at a certain time, judging by how I truly feel about them. And I'm constantly asking myself, what is my motive here? Why am I doing this? What is the outcome that I want? Like I'm always asking myself that, but no longer from a condemning, fearful place. Like when I was a Christian, like, what's your motive here, Alice? Is it Satan or God? It's like, what do I want out of this? It's like a very curious, permissive place that I ask myself that now. And so I think that for myself, and there's actually like a Bible verse that I think Paul writes. I want to say it's in one of the Timothys, where it's like everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. That verse, like, is one that I still can find some pragmatic truth in. It's like, oh, I can do anything I want, especially now that I don't believe in God, or the devil. But not everything's going to be good for me personally. And I think it's up to us as individuals to evaluate for ourselves what feels good for me right now. And that can change. Things that didn't feel like they sat right inside me years ago now do, and vice versa. So I think ultimately it's a very personal thing. And I think it takes a lot of self-knowing and self-acceptance. And I've been out of Christianity now for about, I want to say like 16 years or so. But certainly in the early years out of Christianity, there was a lot of rebellion. And I knew I was rebelling. And I let myself do it anyway, because I trusted myself that I was going to come out the other end empowered with more self-knowledge. And no one can take that from me. And if it ends up being that like don't actually like doing XYZ, cool, I don't have to do it anymore. But I gave myself the permission to find out. And I'm still aware sometimes when I'm operating from a place of reactiveness or rebellion. Like, I think that's a very human thing, but I no longer judge it. I used to judge it as like, oh, we shouldn't do things from a place of reactiveness or rebellion. It should come authentically. But what if rebellion's authentic?
Sure.
Like, I'm authentically choosing to rebel and cross this line just to find out what happens. And I think sometimes there can be sad results. Like, I'm thinking of a friend of mine who grew up Scientologist, and he grew up believing all drugs and psychiatric medication and recreational drugs are bad, and they're all equally bad. So he smoked weed, discovered, oh, this is not as bad at all as what people made it out to be. Let's try this. Let's try harder drugs. And I think that certainly sometimes it can lead to a dangerous place. It did for him. But I also think that we owe it to ourselves on an individual level to find out for ourselves that which we desire to experience and learn about. Accepting that there will be consequences, but this time they're your consequences. Yeah. You chose them, and they're earthly consequences, not spiritual consequences, to my view.
Sure.
And I think that there's a lot of unexpected healing in rebellion. And I do think that eventually we can level out. If I, let's see, I lost my faith at age 21. If I become a Playboy bunny at age 22, I might have a very different relationship to myself, my sexuality, and my body than I do now, many, many, many years later, but I still did modeling, and some of it was topless, and that was rebellious. And I write about it in my book, but for me, it was sacred. It was sacred rebellion. It was intentional rebellion. It wasn't unconscious reactiveness. It wasn't me just being like, wow, well, fuck you, I'm just going to do this. It was like, I'm aware of that spirit of rebellion, that little demon. And I am consciously honoring that is some truthful part of myself that I want to gift myself the permission to explore. And so it was a very intentional rebellion. It was not a reckless rebellion. That's not how it felt for me. Right. It was very full of intention. And so I think that I don't know how it could be taught or explained, because it's such a individual internal process.
And it all goes back to the individuality. It's funny you mentioned the verse, because I still have verses that I like. I'm like, yeah, I really like that, but it just has totally, like, I've always followed, the verse, in a multitude of counselors there's safety. Like, I love the idea of learning from others and watching other people make mistakes so I could skip theirs and make my own and that sort of stuff. But they're also, the caveat to that stuff is nobody has lived your life. So you can get 90% of the information you need from somebody who's almost lived exactly the same, but there's still that 1% that comes down to you and the things that you need. And, it's, and I think it's an ongoing process, like you mentioned, which is so important to remember.